Greetings, dear listeners. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber if you're not one yet. You'll get access to, among other things, the full conversation, as well as other subscriber-only benefits. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
Well, we're here to talk about barbarism.
Barbarism. Barbarianism.
Okay, so just to offer some context to our dear readers, Damir wrote a big, ambitious, really great exploratory essay on the question of barbarism and secularism, two topics that recur frequently in Wisdom of Crowds. So we'll include a link to that in the show notes. I highly recommend that everyone give it a read. It's precisely the kind of piece that I think we take pleasure in publishing here at Wisdom of Crowds. But, obviously most people will not have read the piece yet, at least. So, Damir, do you want to just tell us about what your main argument is and why you felt it was important to write about this topic now?
It's tough. I guess I'll maybe just to kick us off, because you'll remember, maybe about 2 weeks ago, I sort of test piloted parts of the argument, to you and Christine. And then, I don't know, writing such a thing is always such a bear. And as I was saying, just before we started recording, I was up really late, just trying to even kick it off. But anyway, the idea behind it is one that, like, I think we've talked about a fair bit on the podcast, and I've been kicking around a lot, especially since Trump got reelected, and that's this, I think, idea about this current moment and what's to blame. I think that the sort of the cheap and easy way is to just point at Trump and Trumpism and Trump's followers. It's the sort of standard center-left liberal mainstream way, is to be like, these people are barbarians. Where does this come from? I think you and I agreed that in the first term, it was very difficult for Americans and Democrats in particular to even accept the possibility that Trump won fair and square. And, the big changes is that was in the second run, in his third run, was, it's impossible to deny that he actually won. And so the question that then sort of arises is, where did this come from? Why is it here? And again, the sort of the easy reflexive way is to be like, either people are being misled by populism, they're being lazy or whatever, or just half the country is awful and evil and crap. And that's never sat right with me. And I guess what's been sort of gnawing at me for the last few weeks is this idea that the barbarism isn't just on the right, but it's all over, I think, is the way I'd put it. And I think that's the main thrust to what I'm trying to get at with this essay, is to not just be looking at what I think is, real ugliness on the side of Trump and what, he's building on the right, but to take a broader look at what's gone wrong. And I think that the conclusion is that it took a lot more than just, I don't know, whatever rot on the right or whatever else that I think the kind of self-satisfied center-left or like centrist person might say. And yeah, let's leave it at that, and then we can sort of pursue that argument more.
Yeah, well, isn't there a risk of drawing a moral equivalency here and saying that it's not just about the right, but it's a broader American thing, when I don't think we see comparable examples of quote-unquote barbarism on the left? Yes, the left might be stupid, disappointing, overreaching, certainly as it did during the woke period. But can we really put that in the same category of barbarism? Because I think for your case to hold, you have to be able to extend it beyond Trump and Trump supporters.
Yeah, I mean, I go to some lengths in the essay to, I mean, maybe take a sort of a predictable step in the direction of damning Trumpism and putting it in, I think, like a pretty dangerous trajectory that does align with sort of European fascism. And I think that's maybe like the predictable part of the essay in any case. But I think that the kind of barbarism, and what I'm getting at with barbarism, isn't just Nazism and that kind of violence that comes from it, but it's that something important is lost and has been lost in what I sort of, I guess, identify as a strong American turn to towards a kind of selfishness. I think is or like a narcissism, and I guess I sort of loosely identify that as something that congeals, comes together in the center of the 20th century as basically a whole bunch of things coming together. And honestly, this is the part that it's mostly, unstructured reading and suppositions that get to it that probably, could stand to be sketched out in a lot more detail in future essays or even like a much bigger project. And people like Ross Dout that have already done a lot of the work on that. But it's this kind of secularization, I think, that comes to America. And the other sort of like deeper argument in the book is that, the roots of both European barbarism, that is, unbridled Nazism and the kind of, I think, like nihilism that follows it, or, as a handmaiden to it, really does come from a kind of secularization movement in Europe. And, the weird sort of supposition in this essay, which might be disprovable, but I guess is meant to be provocative, is that maybe what we're looking at is that the United States is just about 100 years behind Europe in secularizing, and that all the political turbulence that Europe felt between the two world wars and thereafter, and the forces that unleashed was the product of a kind of nasty unmooring of society. And the United States has been spared that for some time. And it's been on a different trajectory. I mean, it shouldn't oversimplify this and say that there's just like one sort of simple path that all societies tread. But there are sort of suggestive things about that, and I'm sort of poking at that kind of like selfish, almost narcissistic, unmoored way of life. That's maybe more the barbarism, out of which like genuine barbarism of like Nazism comes out of. But it's a barbaric kind of society and existence that comes from that. Maybe that's the way I'd put it.
And I think the part about the U.S. being 100 years behind and all the attendant foreboding that comes with that argument is kind of original. I obviously, a lot of people, including myself, like have made the argument that secularization isn't good for society and that it's sort of like a be careful what you wish for situation. But isn't there something quite different about the European barbarism that we saw around the time of World War I and World War II in that, and you lay this out in the piece, that there's a kind of pretense to high culture that coexists with the barbarism, that you have Nazis who are basically saying, they have this idea of a high German culture, and then they compare Jews negatively, very negatively to that, and say that Jews are a kind of other culture, a lesser culture. And then these are people who are also take pride in going to the orchestra and being into architecture and fine arts and painting I mean, Hitler, I guess, was a painter, um, but but I don't see a lot of that in Trumpism or the white identity politics that we see in different parts of the US. There's no pretense to high culture. There's actually a kind of pride in the anti-intellectual nature of the movement. So how do you make sense of that? That seems quite different to me.
Yeah, I mean, it also took all sorts of just very normal people without pretensions to culture to do a lot of the killing. It's not like
Yeah.
it was just all people in top hats going around massacring and organizing purges and pogroms and whatever else you want. So it's not that the just the point about culture. I mean, I start off with a sort of a perhaps too long, but nevertheless, I felt like it needed it. Long stare at the barbarity of the Nazis as sort of refracted through a couple of passages from a book by this notorious Italian journalist called Curzio Malaparte from his book Caput, which our friend Ben Judah actually recommended to me years ago, and I just got around to it finally. The point of like the general thrust of Malaparte is to just basically thoroughly implicate the Europeans in from top to bottom, and to basically point out that no amount of culturedness insulates you from a kind of base barbarism that motivates a Romanian foot soldier to, with glee, throw a hand grenade into a cellar and then like peek and look at what the hand grenade has done and grin at his colleagues. And that there's something broader than that. That it's not just the intellectuals with their culture. It polluted all of society. So I mean, the point about that was just to sort of drive that point home. The sort of pivot I was trying to do in that part of the essay was to suggest that there's a kind of idea that European decadence came from like a lot of refinement, and maybe that the United States, because it's more authentically democratic and unaristocratic, was somehow insulated from barbarism, that the barbarism comes from this refinement in one way or another. And I think that's just not right at all. And what I was trying to sort of draw at there is this intuition again that that there was a kind of moment where there's a sense of America and like a self-understanding of America that was different than what it ended up in the end of the 20th century and is today. An idea of a healthy democracy that is grounded in something else and something bigger, that's not grounded in the fetishization of the individual. There's something it feels that happened in the 20th century and maybe into the 21st century still developing, is this kind of fetishization of the individual, of the importance of the individual, of the self, of again this kind of like whole sort of thing that I think has pulled generally society away from a more traditional and more religiously grounded outlook to the world and to everything, and centered it more on the person, on the interior self, on selfishness and on narcissism. And that's this kind of barbarism. So it's while the Germans in particular, and Malaparte himself, they have these airs, and it's easy to just be like, oh, this is decadence that leads to this kind of stuff. The decadence came to us as well, I would say. It just came maybe from a different direction is what I'm sort of getting at there.
But isn't the fact that the U.S. almost certainly will not follow in the footsteps of Nazi Germany, isn't that itself evidence of progress? That there isn't this kind of eternal recurrence of barbarism? that we probably will never return to that. Well, I mean, at least in the US. I mean, I think there's certainly other parts of the world that we can point to. So, I mean, that would be one pushback, but also the fact that maybe there's a floor to American narcissism because we're unlikely to see the same degree of secularization that we saw in in Europe, in Western Europe in particular, where you had church attendance going down to 20 or 30%. The US is hovering around 50% and seems to be stabilizing around that, at least for the time being. Maybe that means that the US is somewhat more protected from the decadence and then barbarism that Europe experienced. What would you say to those 2 points?
No, I mean, look, I as I try and do as much as possible, is to avoid the trap of prognostication, because I don't know, it's not a great business to be in. I'm not a bookie, and you know, if I'm right, who cares? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's at least I as I was sort of scrambling to finish it, I tried not to get to the point of saying everything's gone. Maybe the head and the sub were a little bit more sort of nudging in that direction. But I think the essay doesn't do that. I mean, what I was more trying to suggest is, as a warning, you know, that these are the sorts of trends and what we're seeing. You know, I mean, I point out that certainly Trumpism hasn't invented detention centers for migrants and for you know, undocumented or illegal aliens and people who are on lists to be deported or expelled from the country. This has existed before Trump, and so we shouldn't over catastrophize on the one hand, and or pat ourselves in the back that we were better before and now we've like fallen much deeper than you know we were, on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it is important, and this is one of these things, Shadi, I'm sure you feel it too. It's there's just like, it's one thing after another, especially living in DC, especially like trying to follow this stuff or trying not to follow this stuff. Even the act of trying not to follow it is debilitating. And there's Alligator Alcatraz. What the fuck was that? Right? I mean, it's Trump brands, you know, this camp that he sets up like in the swamp somewhere, and it's just personified cruelty. It's not that big that it's going to, you know, sort of, I don't know, like really tip the balance one way or the other. One gets a sense that it's as much for theater, you know, this like absurd and nasty theater of cruelty that Trump has deployed, both I think to signal a kind of ruthlessness to his supporters who are fed up and angry, and as a deterrent of some sort, I suppose, to show, you know, don't come to this country, you're not welcome. And again, to signal to voters that like, I've said I was going to do stuff, I'm going to do stuff. And given that actually doing stuff is a lot harder than theater, they've opted for theater in a lot of it. But still, that's coarsening. That felt kind of new and bad in a profound way. And I think we should really try not to lose sight of that, I guess, is what I'm getting at. And what does that mean? Does this mean that we're headed for Hitlerism? No. But should we note it and like jot it down as an unhappy development in our society? Yeah, I think it's worth jotting that down in a notebook somewhere and saying, yeah, not good, right?
Yeah, I agree. The second part of the argument is intriguing because, and I'd like you to unpack this a little bit more, and maybe this is part of Damir's Catholic phase where you just can't help yourself. You're seeing the power and benefits of religion, at least instrumentally, if not from the position of faith yourself. And I was struck by some of the quotes of folks from the late 19th, early 20th century, where they were very self-aware of how the removal of God from the public sphere in Western Europe was going to be a problem, that people were aware of where this was going before it went where it went. But maybe just like say more about what you think the causal relationship is there.
I mean,
why is religion so important? Why is losing religion so important?
I mean, before we even like sort of, I think, get into some of those quotes, and most of them came from this great book, and this actually, funny little aside for you and listeners. I tried and failed to write this essay last week for the last Tuesday note, and I finally published it on a Wednesday, like a week late. And part of it was, as always, just sort of like getting writing. But I had in my mind this book where a lot of these quotes came from by this French scholar called Thérèse Delpech. And I think she passed away in 2011 or 2012 or something like that.
Hmm.
I think it was a review of her book. And maybe we even had her write at the American Interest. But early on at the magazine that I worked with Frank Fukuyama and the rest of that, our editor, Adam Garfinkel, found it. And the book, I couldn't remember the title of it. And finally, just this week, I found it, and I was like, this is it. And I went back and reread the first few chapters because there was so much good stuff in it that I'd remembered, but I just couldn't track down. The book is called Savage Century, Back to Barbarism. And it's
great title too.
It's really, really terrific. The argument of the book is not exactly the parts that I pull out. It's more complicated. She has more layers to basically what leads to this barbarism, and it's worth sort of exploring on its own terms rather than the parts that I lifted. But the parts that I lifted, and it's one segment of her argument, is that basically it's the beginning of secularization in Europe, and that it is so wrenching to the European mind, basically, that it leads to this kind of flailing about, and this kind of flailing about, both sort of philosophical, political, artistic, finds itself, in after the shock of World War I and the interwar period, reaching for these kinds of sort of affirmative identities that basically end up being Nazism. But the part that I don't think it was in Delpech's piece, but it occurred to me to go back and reread that little thing in Nietzsche, the famous little madman chapter where he declares God is dead. And I haven't looked at that in years. It's such a cliche, like, freshman year in college survey philosophy class, you read that little bit of Nietzsche and everyone goes, "Ooh, God is dead." It's really good. It's sort of one of these things that it kind of sends a chill down your spine, because like Nietzsche's so often just seen as this like anti-Christian, anti-religious, sort of glorifier of the pre-religious set of values and the rest of it. But if you read that little bit, the madman there, the amount of pathos he packs into just 4 or 5 paragraphs, with the full knowledge of what you can see it, like as you read it, what the madman is saying about what the death of God will mean for society. It's really, really incredibly prescient. And what was it, for 1881 or 1882? I forget what the date was that it's written. It's in his book called The Gay Science, and it's remarkable. And the last passage in there is about the famous quote that all the churches of the land become sepulchers for God, which is exactly what modern Europe is now. All the beautiful churches and cathedrals, no one's going them, and there's no actual faith practice going on, and they're just basically graveyards for a faith that's departed the continent. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff, and people have been sort of grappling with it and sort of, I don't know, coming to terms with it for a very long time. And I just wanted to just throw out there that listeners should go back and maybe reread that Nietzsche passage, because he's far too glibly written off as the enemy of all this, and he's far too smart to be that one-dimensional.
Yeah. Do you know the joke about Nietzsche?
God saying something, Nietzsche's dead? I forget. You
No,
love
you're
that one.
Oh man!
No,
messed-
you, says God. And Nietzsche's dead. Is that the joke?
Yeah, more or less. But yeah, so basically Nietzsche scrolls like some graffiti on a wall, or one of his supporters saying, "God is dead, Nietzsche." 'Cause
Right.
Nietzsche said that. And then when Nietzsche dies, someone scrolls some graffiti on the wall, "Nietzsche is dead, God."
Yeah.
The final word.
That's a good one.
But Nietzsche is, I think, an important character in the kind of post-religious right in America. I mean, if you look at folks like Bronze Age Pervert or Curtis Yarvin, there are strong Nietzschean undertones in their writing, and this kind of neo-paganism, this sense of strength above all else. So, yeah, I mean, I think that Nietzsche is a key figure in trying to understand where we are. And yeah,
it's the other thing that if you remember, I was talking to you and Christine and Santi about some of these ideas, and I think maybe one of the early ways that I had phrased it was that in modernity, like especially American liberalism, but just let's say Western liberalism more broadly, in centering the individual in everything, had lost sight of both sort of call it aristocratic values, which maybe one would look at as aesthetic ones of, appreciation of the beautiful, and certainly has become completely revolted with the very idea of hierarchical or monarchical values, which I would argue is the core of certainly any of the monotheistic religions, is that there's an order that exists outside of you. You are not at the top of it. In fact, there is a deity at the top of it, and the moral order comes down to you from that. And the moral order exists outside of you, and you must conform to it rather than it to you, or however else sort of this modernity would have it. And I remember Christine said something along the lines like, "Oh boy, Curtis Yarvin over here," and so I think that's why I really did struggle with getting at a lot of this stuff in a different way, because I'm not like the trap I definitely don't want to fall into is the trap of, the kind of the Nietzsche adorers, these kind of like the true barbarians in all of this, in saying that, like where society has lost its way ultimately is in basically rejecting all of these sorts of things like monarchy and aristocracy, right? Like I think that's a very lazy way to do it. Like it sent me back to the drawing board and trying to unpack exactly what I was getting at. And this goes back to your question earlier about about aristocratic and or like sort of snobby cultural high culture stuff of the Nazis and things like that. I mean, I really did put that in for that very reason, to just like to underline that the aristocratic and or like noble snooty European high culture ways were in fact very much aligned with Nazism and like leads to those nasty sort of things, even if a lot of the sort of angry young men coming up in Weimar Germany were reacting similarly, presumably, as many of the young men coming up right now are reacting to a kind of hollow, empty, and just not just unsatisfying, but like almost barbarically barren, self-centered liberalism that they were facing.
But I guess that's one of the
yeah.
I guess you pointed to like one of the key distinctions between the post-religious right and the religious right. They both believe in hierarchy, but hierarchies of different kinds. If you're religious, you believe in hierarchy, but God is at the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
If you're non-religious right or post-religious right, there's hierarchy, but man
right
is at the top.
That's it.
I think the latter is a lot worse than the former, personally. Anything that elevates man to a kind of exalted state is a recipe for disaster, and ultimately is at the heart of Nazism and communism and other sort of secular ideologies, that there is no limit. Because there is no God, there is nothing to constrain man.
Yeah. No, and I think that's I guess the thing that I hope, you know, readers come away with. You're saying about like the dangers of conflating, you know, barbarisms and all into one. But I just argue that, like, you know, that kind of selfish, like, man-centered worldview about, you know, with the self at the center and all meaning flowing from the self, that leads to, on the one hand, a very kind of, well, I mean, it leads to other things. I was going to say it leads to, in modernity, a very kind of hollow centrist liberalism, which invites resentment, certainly from the right. But even on the left, I mean, you know, I sort of gesture at that too, that, you know, you take it too far in the other direction and you do get, you know, basically all the excesses of the French Revolution. You get all the sort of followers of the excesses of the French Revolution, also strongly secularizing, strongly atheist, strongly suspicious of religion as something that oppresses the individual, and you know, a kind of at the limit inversion of this notion that, like, reason comes from mankind. If mankind is acting unreasonably, mankind must be educated to be reasonable, and to basically come to the right kind of conclusions. And you get that kind of insanity on the left as well. You know, where, you know, insofar as that we're not nearly where Europe is on the right now. We're presumably much further even from, like, the excess of the left. But still, I think it is important to keep in mind that the fetishization of the individual, on both right and left, leads to really ugly things. And it's paradoxically the healthy thing, whether you get there through religion or, well, I'm not sure what else, quite frankly, how one recenters society without it. I mean, I end the essay sort of on a weird note, because noting that all these passions play themselves out in Europe. Europe's no longer on the precipice of war with itself, except maybe precipice of war with Russia at this point. But you know, it doesn't become more religious. Like, but no strong belief system fills the void. They're just sort of like this senescent, dying place at this point. You know, maybe that's the destiny of all sort of old societies after a while, to just sort of drift off into nothing.
But then why doesn't barbarism fill the void? I mean, so that, I guess there's two ways of looking at it. One is that Europe spent its barbarism already in the world wars, and then it had nothing left to offer in that regard. That there is a kind of finite amount of barbarism that any society can offer or contain, and Europe just went through it and then it was done. Or I think you sort of allude to this in the piece, that it's the U.S. and U.S. power that's keeping Europe from becoming barbaric, that basically being Europe's security umbrella and protector, last line of defense or last line of protection, means that Europe doesn't really need to have strong ideologies, or at least that their strong ideologies are constrained in some way by the general comfort that's afforded by U.S. largesse.
Yeah. And you know, a culture of suppressing that sort of stuff, right? That's the other thing. We've seen it in France, we've seen it in Germany, a political culture of keeping extremes out of power, like, you know, with strategic voting and all the rest of that. Look, I think I would lean towards the latter explanation rather than there's some, like, finite resource. The only thing that I'd maybe say about the finiteness of the resource of barbarism maybe is aging, right? I mean, that's the other part of it. European societies are just getting older, insofar as a lot of they're getting young men into society. It's often through migrants, through migration, and people who are not assimilating well into European society. And that's a powder keg in a lot of ways, because young men are sort of a problem that way. But yeah, so I mean, I think it's partly the aging thing, and partly the fact that we facilitated their sort of rehabilitation and growth in this kind of magical garden that they didn't have to face all of these things. So that's why it is an interesting question to see, what the next 20 years are going to look like. If the United States, follows Trump's lead and withdraws more from the continent. Russia's certainly gone through a lot of men, but it's an economy that's now permanently on a war footing. And as gone through a generation of kids coming up with this in the background, with this as a societal definition of some sort. So I don't know what happens, and whether Europe rediscovers a kind of barbarism. Also worth noting that the sort of fringe parties that have been suppressed for so long have been making strides in the last 10, 15 years across Europe. So, we'll see.
To what extent, where do you think barbarism ultimately comes from? Because I think there's one way at looking at human nature and saying that we have a kind of innate disposition against barbarism, that I think a lot of us operate in our daily lives, and we're sort of, we look at barbarism and it feels very unnatural to us. It feels like, oh my God, this is an affront to who we are and what we hold dear. But then there's another view that, like, we're innately pulled. I mean, obviously the classic examples and how this has been tested through various experiments, including the Stanford experiment, where otherwise good people were sort of induced to electric shock their fellow participants in the experiment and that sort of thing. So we know that people are capable of it when they're pushed, or when they have certain incentive structures or contexts that push them in that direction. But I mean, obviously, Damir, you have like a darker view of human nature, where I think you're more likely to view it as there is something inherent in the human consciousness, and it's always there. It can never be extinguished. But maybe that's an optimistic view too, because if your argument is that society constrains our inherent barbarism, then it means that we can do a lot. Like, society plays a very essential role, and we can improve ourselves through the cultivation of society.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mostly subscribe to that last way. The only tough part is how much can we actively do to construct a society? Something. I mean, presumably on the margins, it makes a difference, and you can sort of nudge and push and pull. Maybe through the power of example at the highest levels you can, but can you even control who gets to the highest levels? That you can't really. And I guess this is, what kind of example is Donald Trump, leaving for our children? But I'll just say, I mean, to throw it back at you about the optimism that, you recoil when you see this sort of stuff. Don't you though, like, think, that's why, again, like, I was so transfixed reading the Malaparte the other day and last night, that now, again, just want to note for listeners, Malaparte himself is a bit like Hunter S. Thompson. He writes in a like almost hallucinatory style. It's often over the top, but so we don't have to like rely on Malaparte. There's plenty of evidence of what happened in the 30s and 40s in Europe. Firsthand evidence and accounts. But the most striking part of all of that is that it's less about enabling structures, or maybe there are enabling structures, but they're enabling structures that embolden people to seemingly just, unleash something of themselves. It's not like these structures, or at least to me, reading these accounts, it never feels like these structures are perverting an essentially good humanity into like evil ends. It always feels like, maybe it's a kind of fear. Maybe it's this unrootedness, this kind of sense of, I don't know what to do, and that all sorts of leads to it. But there is something animal in humanity that, if not checked, just seems to lead to horrific things. And I have always struggled with people who assert like a kind of inherent goodness to human nature, as opposed to like inherent brokenness to human nature that needs to be corralled. I don't know, like where's your view sort of like land on that?
So it's interesting. The Islamic position is sort of the reverse of what I just mentioned. The idea there being that human nature is inherently good, and it's society that corrupts us. So, parents, families, communities, political structures, and so forth. And there's a very powerful word in Arabic, fitra, which connotes this innate disposition that is inclined towards the good, that we all have that. And then we're corrupted afterwards. So there's a sort of sequencing there. Unlike in Christianity, where there's, at least in various mainstream strains of Christianity, a kind of conception of original sin. So that, I think, is an interesting contrast between the two faiths in that respect. But I do think that the reason that I recoil, I don't know. I mean, I've never been able to relate to people who have very strong, overbearing political passions. The idea that anyone could be sort of like their lives could be defined around a political cause that subsumes everything else, that feels very foreign to me. I think part of it is I'm just probably too lazy to care. I would just rather be left alone. I'd rather just be in my own world. You also have to deal with a lot of people if you want to be in a political cause that subsumes you. Like I don't like people enough for that to really work, which is why, when I fantasize about running for office, or when other people have jokingly suggest that I might run for office, it's certainly an intriguing thought, but I just like the idea of people that would be required. Oh my God, it feels like...
That's it for part one, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.